Welcome to the Story Behind the Story podcast, a behind-the-scenes exploration of the human experience in all aspects of life, love, and leadership. Today, we're going to explore with Chip Fulghum, President and COO of Endeavors, how leadership, including leading oneself, is cultivated within each person. I'm your host, Angie Bailey.
Hi, I'm your co-host, Lynette Sproles.
Hi, I'm also your co-host, Dominic Petty.
So, Chip, it is such a pleasure to have this opportunity to chat with you today. I have been so fortunate these past 7 years to not only have had you for a boss, but to also consider you a great friend. And leadership is something you and I have spoken about often when we were at the Department of Homeland Security, both on a stage and behind the scenes when we've taken the opportunity to catch up on those long commutes home each night. And you definitely have the it factor as a leader, and I, as well as many others, have certainly benefited from your leadership, both personally and professionally. And so, but Chip, one of the things that we talk about, that we used to talk about often, is it's not just really about, being a servant leader and building trust and relationships and stuff. I think it just goes a lot deeper than that. And often we would talk about the fact that we actually liked each other and we liked our colleagues. And for whatever reason, that seemed to make a much better team. And it also made us, I think, far more productive as an organization. So when you think about that and you kind of, dive in a little bit deeper into yourself, what do you think about this idea or this concept of it's actually okay to like your boss or to like your colleagues?
So first of all, thanks for having me. And it's good to see you again. I do this thing when I go out and talk about leadership, and I start with good versus bad leaders, right? Because all of us know folks who you would consider some of the worst bosses you ever had, but were extremely effective at what they were trying to accomplish. You and I used to talk about one of my bosses. I was convinced he was Satan on earth. Walking around the face of the earth, creating havoc. But he was extremely effective. He used to say leading by fear is an effective way to get the job done. And his bosses loved him. His peers loved him. His people were deathly afraid of him. And what he left behind was a legacy of angst, destruction, anxiety, and I would say somewhat paralysis. So I always like to talk to people about, was Stalin a good leader, right? Asked you that question, you got to think about it, right? Because people always think it's a trick question that, they'll start to raise their hand and I'll go, well, hold on, I don't know exactly what he's doing there. And then you get to the, should you be liked by your boss? And, I always go back to the first boss I ever had in the Air Force. His name was Chuck Smoot. And when I joined the Air Force in '84, it was vastly different than it is today. In fact, the Air Force had no core values stated core values back in 1984. You could smoke in the office and you could say things in the office you would never say now. So it was a vastly different place. But when I got to Vandenberg Air Force Base, I can remember walking down the hall and I could hear this guy just really letting someone have it. And so I kept getting closer and closer, and it kept getting louder. And when I walked in, there sat Betty Crawford like nothing was happening. She said, "Hey, Lieutenant, we've been expecting you, and he'll be right with you." And I was sitting there going, "What the heck?" Right? And so when he finished with that guy, his whole demeanor changed with me. And he put his arm around me and said, "Hey, Lieutenant, we're so glad you're here. Wait till you see all the things we're going to do together." And, we've all had bosses that do that, right? But over time, what I learned was that he did all of that and more. And not only did his people like him, but they loved him. And they loved him because he knew them. And he knew about their kids, and he knew about their spouses. He knew what their needs were at work, and he was always the first one there. And people went above and beyond for him. They would go 150% for him. And so whenever I talk about should you like your boss, I always say, think of the worst boss and think of the best boss. Think of how you perform for the worst. Think of how you perform for the best. Did you like the worst boss you ever had? Did you like the best boss you ever had? And, there's no right or wrong answer there, but I believe you can do a lot more if you build a team together that does like one another. Like you were talking about before, Angie, at DHS, Luke McCormick, our CIO, used to call it the dream team, right? Well, I'm not sure it was the dream team, but
Yes,
I do know that everyone liked one another.
It was the dream team. But you're right. We all liked each other a lot. Like even though there were times whenever we had some, I'll call it creative tension, right? Or we didn't see eye to eye on things, there was still this underlying level of respect. And I have to admit, like in my 40 plus year career, DHS was the first time that I actually had really experienced that, where at those very highest senior leadership levels that you had folks who genuinely liked each other and you knew would have each other's back. And so I wonder sometimes, like, does that really have to do with how a person leads themselves? And Lynette, that kind of takes me into another topic. And, as I've observed, sometimes the reason I think leaders fail to lead is because they're not really even leading themselves. So what are some of the things that you've observed as an executive coach about how well or not people lead themselves? And what are some ways people can hone in on leading themselves and others?
That's a great question, Angie. And I do think often that is a place where leaders, they get promoted because they're good at their job, not necessarily because they're good at leadership. And often that's a part of their skill set that really isn't built upon. And I think that's the place where someone has to really take that time to examine themselves and build their emotional intelligence around what their emotions are and how to self-regulate those emotions. And this is so important to understand, not necessarily from the mind level, but the body level. Like, what are emotions? What do you feel in your body? And how can you learn to shift that so that you can really be present and present for each person? Kind of going to Chip's story earlier, it sounds like this particular person, like, showed up differently for different people in the way that person needed to hear it. And that takes a lot of intelligence about how to manage your own emotions and not allow them to be about you, but allow them to be in a way where the person you're speaking to can benefit the most from that interaction. So just learning to build your emotional intelligence is really important. I also find with leaders quite often, they don't really have their values, what their personal values are. They don't necessarily haven't spent the time learning that and really diving into that. So that's another valuable exercise to say, what are my values around my position? And sometimes keeping those things in line will help you be more targeted with the way you approach different folks.
Oh, well, thank you. And, Chip, along those lines, like thinking about that, because as you know, within DHS, a lot goes on during the day and it's critical. It's a critical mission. But in addition to that, emotions are often running high, right? They're running high for our employees. They're running high for the public that we serve, for leadership, et cetera. So when you're in the mix of all of that, and you've served in many roles there, from the chief financial officer to the undersecretary for management, even as the acting deputy secretary at one point in time, then I was the acting undersecretary for management, although you never really let me act because you were doing all of the jobs at one time. And so I'm just wondering, so what went through your mind is, as Lynette's talking about regulating your emotions, like, how did you practice regulating your emotions? Because you're human after all. It's not like you didn't have emotions. So what were some of the things that you did to regulate that? And were you even conscious of it?
Yeah. So first of all, I really like what Lynn said about the value piece. You really have to examine every day, where your values sit, what are your values, and where is that, what I call compass for each individual every day? Is it drifting a little bit one way or the other? So you've always got to start with that. And so I really like what she said there. As far as DHS goes, first of all, I think leadership is situational, and I know that's soundbite-ish, and we don't like sound bites on this podcast, but What I mean by that is you have to evaluate what's going on in the organization, what is the organization's culture. So at DHS, DHS was born out of what? It was born out of chaos, right? So it was born out of a catastrophic event and chaos. And to some extent, it's never really come out of that, right? So it's constantly churning. So if I'm constantly churning with it, I'm just creating more of the bad stuff than the good stuff. So one of the things I tried really hard to do at DHS was to stay even, right? No matter what was going on around me, I tried to just stay even. Even if inside of me I was like, holy crap, right? Like, you mentioned I was the acting deputy secretary. I remember that day when I was sitting in that office and John Kelly walks in, who is the Secretary of Homeland Security, and walks in and goes, "Hey, I'm John Kelly. Who are you and what do you do?" And I go, "Well, I'm Chip Fulghum and I think I'm your deputy secretary." And he goes, "Great, see you later." And when he walked out the door, I just realized what I had said. And I sat there and went, holy crap, what have I gotten myself into? But because there was so much chaos, you got to stay calm. I also have learned that there are times when you have to show, okay, I am not pleased, right? But you got to do it deliberately. Like someone will go, we'd walk out of a meeting and someone go, "You didn't look very happy." Yep. And it was by design. Because I was trying to use a different method to get someone's attention. But to Lynette's point, if you don't know yourself and know that you can keep yourself calm and keep yourself measured and keep yourself pretty even keeled, you won't be able to do those things. And it meant a lot more. I think, Angie, you know that, right? You rarely saw me publicly get irritated. But when I was, people were like, "Oh, this must really matter."
Yeah, I think to your point, and Lynette touches on this because she does a lot of energy work as well. And so it's really fascinating, right, to see what happens to the energy in a room whether it's as the boss or the colleagues, whatever, as people are like in a positive, you have positive energy, right? When you have this churning that's going on and a lot of negative energy, it just permeates throughout not just the meeting, but quite frankly, the organization. And so I think you touch on something really important about like regulating these emotions that we have as leaders, because our energy, it's not just our emotions and our energy, but our energy actually then carries and kind of bumps off of other people's energies. And it can create a really good environment or it can create a really poor environment. Now, along these lines, Dominic, building off of what Lynette and Chip have really touched on, there is a level of consciousness that needs to be obtained to lead effectively. And I know that sounds very theoretical, but in practical terms, what does it mean to lead with a heightened level of consciousness?
Yeah, Chip, I have a few thoughts, but definitely want to hear yours. I mean, you had just said you responded in a certain way with certain emotion, and it was like by design. And as Angie will tell you, I'm always dealing with consciousness with my clients. And on the consciousness side, a lot of times the word used is intention, like you're acting with intention. And really what comes to that is choice. And so what I find a lot of times that people don't recognize that they have a choice. They'll say, "Well, I reacted," or "I exploded," or "I couldn't help myself." And I think when they make those statements, they're not noticing that they actually do have choice in the matter. And so I'm curious, in your method of cultivating leadership as you became better and better, was there a moment where you realized, wow, how I show up is kind of like the weather for people? And being that that's the case, like I do have these choices and I'm going to make these specific choices, as you said, by design. When did you gain that awareness and how did you gain that awareness?
So I think there's several parts to that. I was thinking about my journey as a leader this morning when I was driving into work. And believe it or not, when I was a young officer, I was probably one of the most introverted people on the planet. I would rather be in an office and doing the job than interacting with people at all. And over time, I began to realize that if you want to move up and gain more responsibility and do more for people and the mission, you've got to get out in front, right? You got to lead. So I had to push myself into a place that initially I didn't like. I wasn't comfortable with it, and I really didn't enjoy it at first. But as you begin to do it and you interact with people, you get so much more out of it, right? And so I began more and more to push myself out there. As far as the consciousness and when I figured out this whole energy thing that y'all were talking about is I used to have this staff sergeant that worked for me, and she sat out in front, and every day she would say, "Good morning, Colonel Fulghum, how are you today?" And I'd say, "Fine." And some days she would go, "Yep, looks like you're better today." And so what was she telling me? I mean, she was telling me yesterday you didn't have your A game. And think about the people you want to be around. And I'm not saying this because Angie's on the podcast, but I loved Angie Bailey. I mean, I just love Angie Bailey. I love being around Angie Bailey. I get energy from Angie Bailey. There's just certain people that, you will just want to sit by and just draw from. I mean, I had this lady that worked for me one time. Her name was Shelley Mosley, and she was one of the most productive people I've ever seen. Happy. Her people loved her. And sometimes I would just go sit in her office and she'd go, "What are you doing in here?" I go, "I'm just drawing off your energy." Because she was so positive and impacted people in such a positive way. That energy goes two ways. Your negative energy impacts just as much as your positive energy. And if you don't think it communicates throughout the organization, you're sadly mistaken. Angie's entire 200 folks that work for her in human capital knew when she was having a bad day, like that. And she's not doing great today. Stay away from her, right? Or same as, it was rare, but same is true with me, right? Just like that staff sergeant, she was like, "Yep, you're doing better today than you were yesterday." And what she was really telling me is that you got to be up. And you've got to be, as y'all say, present, but you got to be up. And I've seen it here at Endeavors. Someone said to me the other day, "Oh, the old Chip is back." So what were they telling me? That before, for whatever reason, I wasn't bringing the same passion, the same energy, and the same positivity that I was before. So it's incredibly important.
That's a really good point. And you said, whenever you said, sometimes people could tell, if I wasn't having a good day, I don't recall anybody saying they had to stay away from me. Maybe you just chose to stay away from me. But let me say this. One thing that I did realize, and this took a while for me to get to this point as well, is that in order to be, I think, a really effective leader, is you have to be a little vulnerable too, right? And so you touched on this, every single day I felt like I had to come in, no matter what was going on in my personal life or my professional life, no matter what my story was, I had to come in with a smile on my face. I had to be upbeat. I had to keep the positive energy going. I just couldn't have a bad day. After a while, that gets overwhelming, and then you have to ask yourself, am I even really being authentic whenever every single day is a good day, even whenever the most tragic thing has happened to me? And so what I really finally learned to do is, I can remember, and Dominic, I don't know if you were there at the time, but I remember saying on a meeting one time, a virtual meeting with everyone, I was like, "You know what, guys, I'm not bringing my A game today. It's just not there. My energy is about as low as it can go. I feel a little overwhelmed. And so I'm going to get through this all hands that we have today. But I just want you to know that I'm just not there today." And it was fascinating, the emails that I got afterwards, from staff members thanking me for actually being honest about the fact that not every day is an A+ day, and that I can still perform and I can still be nice and I can still do all the things I need to do, even though I myself am struggling. And they said that it gave them permission to say that they too were struggling as well, despite the fact that they were still performing. And so Lynette, along those lines, you and I have had many conversations, with regard to this, and you've even taught classes on this as well. And so could you expound on that a little bit better? Because you're far better at explaining this than I am.
Yeah. So that with our emotions, our heart puts out a field that's about 2 feet around our body. And so as you were explaining earlier, Chip, that you just like to be around this person, it was because you were within that 2 feet. And it really extends beyond that. But right now, the magnetometers can measure out 2 feet. So when you're in that person's presence, it can help you shift more into that same vibrational energy. And it also, it does carry through online as well, Angie. So like you're saying, when you give your staff like, yeah, I'm really not in my A game today, they could feel that whether you are or you aren't. So that's responsible leadership, in my opinion, is when like, I know what I'm putting out there is not healthy for other people, and being aware of that so that you can shift it within yourself. And also, when you can notice someone else isn't, giving them the ability to try to shift as well. So bringing in more of a positive vibration to it allows them to shift through the circumstance as well. And Chip, it's so fascinating to hear you talk about, this perception of energy, because it just shows how we all know it's the natural reality. We just use different vocabulary for it. But to me, the more that we learn to step in our own energy, be self-aware of our own emotions, and realize what we're putting out there, it allows everyone to step into that vibration. And I always feel like for leaders, it's important to decide, what emotion do you want to have a conversation from? Then get within that emotion so that when you go into that conversation, you're putting that vibration into the energy field. Because when we come in with a negative emotion and we have a conversation, it puts the other person automatically into fight or flight. If they come in and you're not in a good place and they sense that, it just automatically triggers the amygdala to say, oh, something in my surrounding area might endanger my safety. So it all kind of goes back into that being responsible for our own emotional state.
So I really like the way you described it. It's way more sophisticated than I could ever describe it. I look at vulnerability as building trust. Mm-hmm. So, and I still believe that's the centerpiece of leadership is trust. And being vulnerable with someone doesn't mean you share all your secrets at home, what's going on at home and all those things, but it's showing that you're people. I always tell people, that leader over there, they're a human being. And so they're going to have their ups, their downs, they're going to have their good days, their bad days. But, we've got to be more and more, I see that we have to be empathetic. And, empathy is something that probably when I was at DHS, I probably never used that word, empathy. But more and more I see that as leaders, especially I guess COVID really brought it home, right? That you've got people who were at home who were trying to be teachers, parents, caregivers, and trying to do their job, dealing with the loss of a loved one, all in the span of one day, right? And you have to show people empathy, and you had to show people some grace. And it's not easy, right? Because you've got a job to do, you got a mission to do, and all those things. But I just more and more believe in this whole concept of walking in someone else's shoes, giving a little grace, and that whole concept that Angie talked about of, I like what she did. She trusted her team enough to know that it was okay if I'm vulnerable, because that's the real issue, right? Because if you're vulnerable and there's not a great deal of trust there, you're going to be concerned that, okay, what are they going to do with what I just said or how I just said it, right? So I really like the way she did that. And I think what it also does is it allows another team member to pick up the slack, right? So she used to have Chloe and Roland and all those other folks who could sense that probably and go, I got you today, Angie. I can pick up the slack for you today and bring the positive energy that I know you want to bring to whatever it is you're trying to do. So that's a pretty complex issue. Because it sounds good and briefs well to say, let's just be vulnerable. But I grew up in the military, and there are a lot of words you use. Vulnerability was not one of them in any leadership book. And so whenever I go talk to military folks now, I talk to them about being vulnerable, and they look at me like I've got three eyes, right? They're like, no, we don't do that. So it's a complicated topic, but I think to your point of trying to get deeper into your own self as a leader, being vulnerable is a part of it.
Chip, as you were talking about, vulnerability there, and just taking into mind your whole career, what comes to mind for me is that a lot of times when we get into roles, we think the job is a particular thing. So like leadership, I think a lot of times what comes to mind is excellence, doing a great job, hitting the target. And I'm curious if you have things in addition to vulnerability that, it's the job, but you don't realize the job. It's a job to be vulnerable. It's the job to create an environment where people are open to liking you. Are there things in addition to those?
So I think there are a couple of other things that come to mind. I really think that relationships and knowing people matters. I could have never had the leadership relationship with Angie had I not known what had happened to her 2 years before. And understanding where she came from, both professionally, what went on at OPM, but both what went on in her personal life. And she was open enough and trusting enough to share that with me. But that takes time, right? And, I always say cliche here, but to move up, you got to give up. And what you're going to give up is time. And because it takes time to build relationships with people and get to know them. I used to tell people one of my biggest disappointments at DHS is we had about 2,000 people in the Undersecretary's direct reporting chain in the lines of service. And a lot of them worked at 7th and D. And every day I would come to work and I would get in the elevator to go up, and invariably 2 or 3 of them would get in there, and all of them, hey, Chip, hey, how are you? Hey. And I would just be looking around going, I'm fine. How much better would it have been if I could have said, hey, Lynette, how are you? And how's your husband doing? And how was that kid's soccer game? Those little things matter to people. And you talk about energy, they take that positive interaction and it carries with them throughout the day. And, one of my favorite stories at DHS, in addition to knowing them, is just saying thanks. Angie had this person that worked for her. I think his name was Gary Myers. I think that was his name. And
yes,
he had this volunteer chaplain program for law enforcement. He just did it, right? It wasn't in his job description. He just did it. And I thought it was the coolest thing ever. So I just wrote him a note. I hand wrote him a note and sent it over to him, hoping that the mail system would get it to him. And about 2 weeks later, I get this email back from Gary, and it said, hey, I've been here for 10 years, and this was a highlight of my time here that you took the time to say thanks. So I guess one thing is little things matter. The other thing is let your people fail. And that's really hard in the government. I had this thing called, I'd call it innovative failure, right? Not poor performance, but innovative failure. And allowing your people the space to try something. And if it doesn't work, you've got their back and you go, it's okay. I think as a leader, if you want to get better and your organization wants to get better, you've got to be able to create that space. And again, that sounds easy and it briefs well, but when you're in an organization that has, at last count, over 100 congressional committees that think they have some jurisdiction over your agency, try creating a culture of innovation where that alone is sitting on top of you. It's extremely difficult, but you got to give people that space. But I think the most important thing is, and I know it sounds somewhat trivial, but is you got to get to know them. You got to know what makes them get up and what pushes them down. And it goes back to what we talked about a minute ago, which is that situational leadership, right? Which is, Angie doesn't react well to certain things. Angie does not react well to get in her face. That is not a good way to get her to go from point A to point B, right? Whereas other people need that, right? Like that guy we talked about before that Chuck Smoot was talking to. He really needed someone to, grab him by the neck and go, come on, you got to go. So, I think those to me are some other things that as a leader you've got to do in addition to being vulnerable and being somewhat empathetic and trying to put yourself in the other person's shoes.
It's interesting. I think sometimes to your point, we call that situational leadership, right? But I was just thinking that in terms of like what Dominic, Lynette, and I have been exploring over these last couple of years, in some ways, I think it's like being really super aware at a conscious level of what's going on around you and what the energy is around you and how that person will feed off of what you're doing and things. And so it's almost like, are we consciously choosing to be situational, or have we evolved to the point that, like, some of us at least have evolved to the point where we can read people's energy, not even realize it. We can read a situation, we can read a room, like we can just read an environment, and then we learn how to adapt and adjust ourselves to that particular person or environment, culture, etc. And so, Dominic, I'm wondering, does that make sense to you? Is that what you're seeing also, like in your private practice that you have as well?
Absolutely. I mean, I think, reading energy, it comes in a variety of ways. Reading energy, it's kind of like, oh, I could tell the person was in a bad mood or a happy mood. And it even goes to some people having the ability, they'll look at a person's aura. So Lynette mentioned that, people's field from their heart extends 2 feet. Well, if you look at these things, there are people that say, and I believe that you actually have an energetic aura around you, and it has a certain cue or certain color to it. There's a place near me that does aura photography. It'll actually take a picture of it, and there's always an interesting story behind it. And so I think, to your point in terms of reading energy, what happens over time, I find when my clients get better, they become better at leading themselves, and they're able to check in more and catch where their emotions are. And another way of saying is that they become more present with themselves. And so they realize there's this choice, and they're like, wow, I'm really upset. And here's this point where I can do the usual thing I would do, where I would explode, or I would insult the other person, or I would take all responsibility and I would put it on the other person and have them try to sort things out. And it's when you have that choice and you make a different choice with the intention of creating a different outcome. And a lot of times you don't know what that outcome is going to be, but your general intention is that I want this outcome to be different and better. And so I think when that's brought to the table, it encompasses what you're talking about with saying that, yes, you do become more aware of the energy because you become more aware of yours. And you also become more aware of the impact you're going to have in the next moment when you make that next choice. And it even comes down to the facial expressions, which I find super interesting because, depending on the book you read, I think maybe there's agreement, 80% of communication is body language. And so the talk is actually in the minimum. It's really how you're going to act. But I find so much is communicated in the face. I mean, they talk about having a poker face. You're playing a poker. You don't want everyone to know you have like the winning hand or the losing hand. And, when you're in conversation with someone, I think the intention it's the desire for intention it should be very strong there to saying like, what do I want to communicate with my face in my body language, even when I'm saying nothing. So I always encourage people, to always check in on the energy level, like their own, and what is the energy person? And if energy is like too vague, I would just say mood. Because we all understand, like, what mood am I in? What mood is the room in? What mood is the person I'm talking to in?
Angie,
Yes,
you gotta let me chime
well,
in here because
of course.
I love what he said about nonverbal communication because it fascinates me, and I think it starts with your own, right? How many people really stop to go, how do I communicate nonverbally? And unless you are willing to get feedback from others, right, and accept it, you probably don't know. So for me, I know y'all are going to find this hard to believe, but it's my face, right? I know Angie has told you I'm a handsome middle-aged guy, but the reality of it is my face sometimes communicates the opposite of what I'm thinking. And I learned this when I was in the Pentagon. When I was in the Pentagon, this individual came to work for me later on, and I was sitting down talking with her, and I said, you were in the Pentagon same time I was. We were pretty close in the same organization, but I never saw you. And she said, well, when I saw you, I went the other way. I go, well, what do you mean by that? She goes, well, you look pissed off. So whose problem is that, right? Is it hers or it's mine? It's mine. And it's something that you got to be, to your point, you got to be aware of, because if you think you're communicating in this positive way and everyone around that room's going, I can't wait to get out of here because he looks really irritated, because to your point, what's going on here is only 20% of what's being communicated. You've just got to have a lot of self-awareness there. And the other thing that fascinates me is that people don't realize others' nonverbals. They don't study them. They don't study their leaders, their bosses' nonverbals. I had this individual I worked for at DHS, and they had a couple of interesting nonverbals. One was they would do this on the table. They would tap on the table, and that meant it's time to stop talking. And then they would just keep going, and then they would start doing this, right? And you're like, either we're going to watch this person's head pop off, literally, or we need to stop talking. But people just are so oblivious to nonverbals and how much of nonverbal communication is so important. That's why the whole camera thing, right? During COVID, how many people turned their cameras off? And I were talking today before we got on here about what to wear during COVID and what people wore, and so they just turn their cameras off. But you're turning off 80% of the communication, right? When you turn that off, and the other challenge is it's hard to read a room when you've got a gallery of 20 people on the screen and trying to figure out what they're all actually thinking. So I agree with you, Dominique. It's so important to understand what your nonverbals are putting off, because they're a lot of times way different than what you actually think you're doing. And I think there is a genuine piece of it too. So to Angie's point earlier, where she's, got to come in every day and she's bouncy and happy and you're like, I know she's not, right? So over time you go, that's just fake, right? That's not the real Angie Bailey. Now, that's not true with Angie. I mean, because you got all the, you got all the range of emotions with Angie, which is a positive thing. But I think you just got to be real with yourself. And once you understand yourself, you got to avoid some of those bad things, but you got to be who you are, because that lends to the credibility and trust that people are going to have in you.
I'm going to pull the thread just a little bit on this, or at least give a tip of something that I used to do. This is back before I really was in the senior executive service, but I was at a defense agency at the time. And I learned this art of I would go into the room and I would sit down with all the senior leaders at the table, and I would just observe them. And I would observe, like, as the general was speaking about something he wanted to do, I would just watch to see the eye contact that would go on between the different senior executives, right? Because that told me who was lining up with who. That told me who was actually, bought into it or didn't buy into it. And so I learned to, I think, fine tune that over a while, is to just, even whenever I'd be in a congressional hearing, even while like someone else was being asked a question, I would pay attention to, the different congressmen and congresswomen, and just like understand, like, what is their body language telling me? And then what direction do I want to go as a result of that? Even your staff meetings, Chip, I would sit and just be quiet and just like watch again who's lining up with who's doodling, who's doing something they shouldn't be, who's engaged, all those kinds of things were just incredibly helpful to me as I tried to then map out the direction in which I wanted to go as well. Lynette, do you have any thoughts on this? We're getting close to, like, kind of wrapping up a little bit. And I was just wondering if you had any closing thoughts.
Yeah, actually, something Chip talked about earlier, really, I heard something in there that I think is so important when it comes to vulnerability and self-awareness, is it's easier for us to give love to others than it is to receive. So as he's talking about this situation in the elevator where employees were saying, "Hey, how are you, Chip?" They wanted to give love to him, but it sounded like at that point, maybe you weren't in a place to receive it. But then I also hear, as you're talking about different aspects of your career, when you're sitting in the office with someone who you could just feel the energy filled, and with Angie, and it felt positive, you were in a place to be more vulnerable and receive their love. And I think that's a place where another aspect of self-awareness is just saying, am I receiving the love someone else is trying to give me in this moment? And allowing them to give that gift to us. And I think that's a place with vulnerability so many of us don't do. We don't really allow ourselves to receive that love, and we miss that gift in that moment.
I think, to your point, it's the coolest part of leadership, right? Is the interactions you get to have, the opportunities that you're presented as a leader to have those interactions and build that deep trust and relationship. And it does come down to what I call professional love. It's a different type of love, but you've got to, again, be vulnerable and willing to give it, right? So I think, and you're putting yourself out there at that point, right? Because you want to have that kind of relationship because of the team that it creates and all the things that go with it. But it's not easy to do, and it's rare where you find a group of people that can connect that way. And when you find it, boy, you better hold on to it, because it is remarkable in what you can achieve together when it's built on a foundation of, like Angie said, way back at the start, about liking each other. And it turns into something like what Chuck Smoot built. And, I used to tell people all the time, if Chuck Smoot were still with us and those leaders were together again today here in San Antonio, and we said, let's go up to the top and jump. And if he said jump, people would go. They would go because they believed in him that much. They loved him that much. They trusted him that much. And as a leader, when you can build that, where there's so much unknown, but you're gonna take that leap, that makes it all worth it. And it's not always going to work, and sometimes it's going to hurt, and sometimes you're going to have to do things that you don't want to do in terms of the people that are around you. But boy, it's the biggest opportunity you have as a leader, and you never want to miss it. and because of the difference you get to make in people's lives.
Well, Chip, I want to thank you so much for sharing what leadership looks like from a conscious soul level with me, Dominic, and Lynette today. And I look forward to diving deeper into the stories behind the stories each month. For more information and to learn more about us, please go to www.anundalife.org. Have a wonderful
Thank you,
day.
Chip.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.